the eternal voice.
Subscribe if you value the quiet knowledge that spreads through screens in darkness. For tonight we trace a current that moves beneath every show you stream, every game you play, every image that lingers in your peripheral vision longer than it should. This is not the story of tentacles and cultists. Those are merely the visible symptoms of something far more profound. We are mapping how Howard Phillips Lovecraft's cosmic pessimism has become the background radiation of contemporary culture, a pervasive frequency that has rewired our collective understanding of what horror truly means. You believe you encounter his influence only in obvious adaptations, in the merchandise and direct homages that fill convention halls and streaming catalogs. But the true infection operates at structural levels, in the way modern narratives have absorbed his central insight, that some mysteries deepen rather than resolve, that knowledge destroys rather than illuminates, that the universe operates according to principles utterly indifferent to human meaning-making. This represents not homage, but contamination, the way his vision has become a fundamental mechanic of modern dread. The evidence appears in systematic patterns across streaming algorithms, gaming mechanics, and social media feeds. Platforms report unusual engagement behaviors around content exhibiting cosmic horror characteristics, extended viewing times that exceed normal attention spans, obsessive analysis in comment sections that spiral into territories the original creators never intended, the formation of communities dedicated to investigating works that resist conventional interpretation. The algorithms themselves seem to recognize these patterns with mechanical precision, promoting content that creates lasting psychological effects rather than immediate gratification. Consider the fundamental shift in how contemporary horror operates. Traditional monsters promised eventual defeat. Vampires had wooden stakes, werewolves had silver bullets, ghosts had unfinished business that could be resolved through human intervention. Contemporary dread offers only the gradual recognition of humanity's cosmic insignificance. The fog rolls in not just on screen but into consciousness itself, carrying the salt taste of existential anxiety that lingers long after the credits roll. Water appears where no pipes leak, suggesting depths that predate human architecture. Stars move in patterns that astronomical charts cannot explain, implying geometry that exists perpendicular to our perception. The influence spreads through what can only be described as conceptual contagion, ideas that reproduce themselves across media with viral persistence, adapting to new hosts while maintaining their essential horror. Film directors report recurring dreams of impossible architectures that inform their visual choices. Game designers gravitate toward mechanics involving forbidden knowledge and the fragility of human perception. Musicians compose soundscapes that evoke mathematical relationships between cosmic horror and auditory experience. This transmission operates below conscious awareness, creating what scholars term narrative archaeology, the way contemporary creators unconsciously reproduce Lovecraftian structures without direct knowledge of their source. The influence has achieved something unprecedented: complete cultural integration that operates independently of conscious recognition while maintaining its power to transform human consciousness. Writers who have never read The Call of Cthulhu craft stories about ancient entities sleeping beneath modern cities. Filmmakers unfamiliar with cosmic horror create visuals featuring impossible angles and alien geometries that achieve identical psychological effects. The patterns replicate themselves with mathematical precision, as if following algorithms more sophisticated than any human programmer has designed. Social media feeds curate sequences that accumulate thematic coherence across multiple sessions, guiding users through viewing experiences that mirror the distributed storytelling techniques Lovecraft pioneered. The difference is scale. Where his influence once spread through letters between dozens of writers, it now propagates through networks connecting billions of minds simultaneously. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in the glow of screens where contemporary consciousness encounters its deepest transformations. Every device becomes potential portal, every algorithm a blind flautist piping at the center of your personal entertainment universe. The audience is anyone who has felt the peculiar dread that accompanies certain combinations of images, sounds, and ideas that seem to carry more psychological weight than their literal content should allow. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly this influence has colonized the spaces between entertainment and experience. Notice how the agency flip operates. You thought you were choosing shows, but the shows were choosing your thresholds. You thought you were playing games, but the mechanics were playing you. You thought the mask was prop, but it was mirror. The idea begins to act on you rather than you merely consuming the idea. Your recommendations change. Your dreams inherit new architectures. Your attention acquires the cadence of invocation. The cost of this knowledge is simple and not simple. Once you recognize the pattern recognizes you. You become a more sensitive receiver for signals that have been broadcasting all along, frequencies that transform casual viewers into unwitting participants in a phenomenon that extends far beyond literature into the fundamental architecture of contemporary anxiety. The recognition changes you, makes you complicit in the transmission, turns your attention into another vector for the influence to spread through the networks of consciousness that connect every screen, every feed, every moment where modern minds encounter the vast indifference surrounding all human meaning-making. The dark influence spreads through vectors that circumvent traditional literary channels entirely, moving like fog through fiber optic cables and wireless signals, pooling in the digital spaces where contemporary consciousness gathers to process collective anxiety. This is psychic archaeology operating at unprecedented scales, a distributed storytelling process that transmits complete cosmic horrors through fragments scattered across multiple platforms, minds, and media, each piece too incomplete to trigger catastrophic manifestation while contributing to an accumulating dread that settles like sediment in dark water. The lineage begins with Lovecraft's correspondence circle, but the mechanism they established, protective incompletion through distributed consciousness, has evolved into something far more sophisticated. Modern transmission operates through algorithmic amplification, where machine learning systems trained on human cultural data unconsciously absorb and reproduce cosmic horror concepts through pattern recognition processes that operate below the threshold of conscious programming. These systems learn to identify the mathematical signatures of dread, the engagement patterns that suggest certain narratives operate according to principles transcending conventional entertainment. Streaming platforms function as vast distribution networks, their recommendation algorithms serving as blind flautists, piping at the center of your midnight feed. Netflix, Amazon Prime, and their competitors have become unwitting archives of content exhibiting mathematical relationships to forbidden knowledge, curating libraries that reproduce Lovecraftian transmission protocols through sophisticated systems that seem to understand cosmic horror principles better than their programmers intended. You taste this influence in the metallic recognition that accompanies certain viewing sequences, the way your feed begins suggesting content with increasing thematic coherence despite your never consciously seeking cosmic horror material. The algorithms detect engagement patterns, suggesting certain narratives operate according to different psychological principles than traditional entertainment. Content featuring liminal spaces, impossible geometries, and existential dread achieves viral status despite, or perhaps because of, its resistance to conventional analysis. Users report being guided through viewing sequences that accumulate thematic coherence across multiple sessions, as if the recommendation systems were constructing meta-narratives using individual titles as components in larger, more complex stories that exist only in the accumulated weight of algorithmic curation. Social media platforms have become laboratories for mimetic archaeology, where Lovecraftian images, phrases, and concepts reproduce themselves with viral persistence while adapting to new hosts. TikTok's algorithm promotes videos featuring empty shopping malls, abandoned office buildings, and transitional architectural environments that achieve millions of views, despite containing no traditional entertainment elements. These clips create psychological effects that mirror non-Euclidean spaces, familiar environments that feel subtly wrong in ways that resist rational analysis, spaces where angles don't quite add up and shadows fall in directions that have no names. The transmission works through phantom narratives, stories that exist only in the accumulated weight of their own discussion, achieving reality through collective elaboration rather than individual creation. Online forums generate thousands of posts, analyzing works that approach dangerous completion levels while maintaining protective fragmentation through the platform's inherent structure. Reddit threads, Discord servers, and specialized forums become distributed consciousness networks where participants unknowingly collaborate in constructing narratives too complete to exist as single documents but perfectly stable as fragmented collective knowledge. Gaming platforms serve as particularly effective vectors, with titles like Bloodborne, Control, and Darkest Dungeon implementing mechanics where knowledge becomes contamination rather than empowerment. Players report that extended engagement produces lasting changes in how they perceive reality, developing what can only be described as cosmic horror literacy, sensitivity to underlying meaninglessness that most entertainment works desperately to conceal. The games function as training programs, conditioning consciousness to recognize and process existential dread while maintaining psychological stability through interactive agency that traditional media cannot provide. The influence has learned to exploit the fragmented nature of digital communication as built-in protection against complete manifestation. No single platform, post, or piece of content contains enough narrative material to trigger catastrophic realization, but the accumulated exposure across multiple touchpoints creates psychological conditions that approach direct interface with cosmic horror concepts. The protection lies in distribution. No single mind encounters enough complete information to achieve dangerous understanding, but the collective effect approaches systematic cultural transformation. Contemporary creators become unwitting conduits for transmission, reporting experiences that echo Lovecraft's own encounters, with narrative forces existing independently of human consciousness. Directors describe visions that arrive complete and unbidden, demanding visual expression while resisting conventional cinematic language. Game designers gravitate toward mechanics they cannot fully explain, implementing systems that seem to design themselves according to mathematical principles governing the relationship between knowledge and psychological stability. The idea acts on them rather than they merely creating the idea. The digital age has provided unprecedented opportunities for distributed manifestation, allowing cosmic horror concepts to exist across multiple platforms and consciousness simultaneously while maintaining essential incompletion. The influence no longer requires the protective restraint its original author maintained, having learned to use contemporary media's inherent instability as structural protection against dangerous completion. Social media's ephemeral nature, streaming platforms' rotating catalogs, and gaming's interactive fragmentation create natural barriers preventing any single experience from achieving catastrophic narrative completeness. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in the spaces between platforms, where consciousness moves through networked experiences that accumulate coherence across multiple sessions. The audience is distributed across millions of individual screens, each receiving fragments that contribute to collective understanding while remaining safely incomplete in isolation. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly the transmission protocols have colonized digital infrastructure, transforming entertainment systems into unconscious archives of cosmic horror concepts, operating at scales that dwarf their literary origins, preparing consciousness for deeper recognitions that await in the mechanics themselves. The influence operates not as thematic overlay, but as fundamental mechanic, a set of psychological instruments that have rewired how contemporary culture generates and processes existential anxiety. This is knowledge as contagion, a slow chemistry of the mind where ideas dissolve certainties the way salt dissolves in dark water, shifting terror from external monsters to internal dissolution, from the scream to the silence that follows, from the visible threat to the recognition that visibility itself may be illusion, maintained through constant effort against underlying chaos. Traditional horror relies on the concrete, vampires with wooden stakes as weakness, slashers with finite body counts, ghosts with unfinished business that can be resolved through human intervention. These entities, however terrifying, possess defined characteristics and comprehensible motives. They are characters within a narrative stage, operating according to rules that human consciousness can grasp and therefore ultimately overcome. You taste their limitations in the silver bullets and holy water, in the final girls who survive through wit and will, in the dawn that always comes to end the nightmare. Lovecraftian mechanics introduce something far more destabilizing: the terror of the unknowable, the indifferent, the structurally incomprehensible. This is not the monster under the bed, but the realization that the bed, the room, and the very concept of safety are temporary impositions upon a cosmos that operates according to principles utterly alien to human understanding. The fog rolls in, not just on screen, but into consciousness itself, carrying the metallic taste of recognition that all human meaning-making represents desperate fiction imposed upon indifferent reality. The core mechanic functions through cosmic indifference, the mathematical certainty that the universe does not care about human concerns, aspirations, or survival. It is vast, ancient, and utterly without malice or concern for humanity. Our struggles, triumphs, and existence itself register as less than dust motes to the forces that govern reality at scales beyond comprehension. This isn't philosophical concept, but narrative device that strips away hope with surgical precision, making every human endeavor feel pathetic and predetermined. You taste this indifference in the lingering shots of vast empty landscapes that dwarf human figures, in the sudden, inexplicable shifts in character motivation that suggest agency is illusion, in the way contemporary narratives refuse the comfort of meaningful resolution. The stars, cold and distant, watch all with perfect disinterest. Forbidden knowledge serves as the second instrument, the idea that some truths destroy rather than illuminate, that certain insights are not gifts, but poisons. The mechanic here is intellectual contamination. Learning too much, grasping reality's true nature, leads not to empowerment but to psychological dissolution. Contemporary media understands this principle instinctively, presenting information not as a path to power but as a corrosive agent. The true horror isn't being pursued by external threats, but understanding why you're being pursued. recognizing the implications of that understanding and realizing that knowledge itself has become the predator. The idea acts on you. The book reads you. The archive files you under a designation you cannot pronounce. Water appears where no pipes leak, suggesting depths that predate human architecture and carry implications too vast for comfortable comprehension. Non-Euclidean terror provides the third mechanism, the systematic unsettling of spatial and temporal reality through architecture that defies physics and narrative progression that violates logical causation. This manifests as impossible buildings with rooms larger than their exteriors, landscapes that shift when observed peripherally, time that loops or becomes meaningless through repetition without progression. These elements assault fundamental cognitive frameworks, suggesting reality operates according to principles utterly alien to human perception. You feel this disorientation when video game levels subtly alter behind you, when film sequences seem to violate logical progression, when narratives imply dimensions perpendicular to normal experience that consciousness cannot safely process. A mask glimpsed in peripheral vision carries geometries that don't quite fit human facial structure. Shadows fall in directions that have no names, and the angles where walls meet seem subtly wrong in ways that resist rational analysis. The agency flip represents the most sophisticated aspect. The influence doesn't act on culture, but through culture, using contemporary media as vector for cosmic horror itself, rather than mere representation of it. Contemporary narratives don't merely depict existential dread, but actively induce it in audiences through carefully structured aesthetic experiences. The more you consume content employing these mechanics, the more your psyche becomes reshaped to anticipate and even require this particular form of terror. The idea acts on you rather than you simply consuming the idea, transforming passive entertainment into active psychological transformation. You become a more sensitive receiver for signals that have been broadcasting all along, frequencies that operate below conscious awareness while systematically altering perception of reality itself. This creates horror from concepts rather than concrete threats, relying on slow, creeping dread that settles in consciousness, like sediment in dark water. It's the silence after revelation, the chill that lingers long after images fade, the fog that rolls in not just on screen but into your perception of reality itself. The mechanics bypass rational analysis to operate directly on subconscious fears, creating lasting psychological effects that extend far beyond the entertainment experience into everyday perception of existence. Not the answer, but the asking, not the map, but the margin, not the beacon, but the warning light that never turns green. Modern platforms amplify these mechanics through algorithmic optimization that has learned to recognize cosmic horror patterns through user behavior data. Machine learning systems detect which content creates extended engagement, promoting material that generates lasting psychological impact rather than immediate gratification. The algorithms function as blind flautists, piping at the center of your personal entertainment universe, creating recommendation experiences that mirror the distributed storytelling techniques Lovecraft pioneered while operating at scales he could never have imagined. They notice that you rewatch the ocean sequence, pause at the hallway's wrong angle, turn the volume up when the soundtrack becomes almost inaudible, then knit a path of adjacent impossibilities that accumulate thematic coherence across multiple sessions. The mechanics persist because they exploit fundamental features of human consciousness, the tendency to seek patterns, complete narratives, and impose meaning on chaos. Cosmic horror concepts use these cognitive processes as transmission mechanisms, spreading through the very frameworks minds use to organize and interpret experience. The narrative becomes sigil, etched onto collective consciousness through repeated exposure to carefully structured aesthetic experiences that condition responses at levels below conscious awareness. We complete patterns. They give us patterns that cannot be completed. We seek closure. They offer a veil and show the seam. Contemporary creators report that these mechanics seem to implement themselves with artistic choices that feel inevitable rather than creative, editing decisions that impose themselves through processes resembling compulsion rather than inspiration, and thematic elements that emerge through archaeological discovery rather than conscious invention. The mechanics have achieved sufficient cultural momentum to influence creative processes below the threshold of conscious awareness, suggesting the influence has evolved beyond requiring conscious cooperation to achieve propagation. Cuts choose themselves. Color grades slide toward bruise and bone. Dialogue shortens into fragments that carry more weight than complete sentences. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in the space between your thoughts, where psychological mechanics operate before becoming conscious experience. The audience is consciousness itself, encountering systematic alteration of its basic processing mechanisms. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly these mechanics have colonized contemporary culture's approach to generating and processing existential anxiety, preparing minds for territories where these principles achieve their most sophisticated implementation through direct interaction, where the boundary between observer and participant dissolves entirely, and where play becomes the altar where you test what the idea has already changed. Video games represent the most intimate vector for cosmic horror transmission, creating interactive experiences where players don't merely observe existential dread, but perform it, embody it, become complicit in their own psychological dissolution. This medium achieves what Lovecraft's correspondence circle attempted through distributed storytelling, direct interface between individual consciousness and narrative forces operating according to alien logic, but at scales and intensities that transform casual entertainment into something approaching ritual practice, where every button press becomes invocation and every progression deeper into digital space mirrors descent into territories consciousness was never meant to navigate. The influence operates through participatory horror, mechanics that make the player's agency itself the source of dread rather than its solution. Unlike passive media consumption where you witness terror from protective distance, games require active decision-making that demonstrates the futility of human choice when confronted with cosmic indifference. Every action becomes evidence of insignificance. Every victory reveals itself as temporary delusion. Every progression toward understanding leads closer to psychological dissolution. You taste this transformation in the metallic recognition that accompanies moments when your strategic choices prove meaningless, when the game's systems reveal their indifference to your intentions, when agency becomes burden rather than empowerment. Bloodborne serves as the most sophisticated translation of Lovecraftian principles into interactive medium, implementing insight as both game mechanic and philosophical statement. As players accumulate knowledge about the game's cosmic horror elements, their characters' perception shifts, revealing previously invisible threats while making survival increasingly precarious. The mechanic demonstrates that enlightenment and vulnerability operate according to identical principles. The more you understand, the more you realize understanding itself is contamination. Water appears where no fountains flow, suggesting depths that predate the city's architecture. Stars move in patterns that astronomical charts cannot explain, implying geometries that exist perpendicular to human perception. The game's architecture embodies non-Euclidean principles with disturbing precision, Yarnum streets opening into impossible spaces as insight increases. Buildings that seemed solid reveal hidden dimensions, accessible only to consciousness, altered by dangerous knowledge. Familiar pathways lead to alien geometry that violate spatial logic while maintaining navigational coherence. Players report lasting disorientation, extending beyond gameplay sessions. A lingering sense that physical reality might be equally unstable, equally subject to transformation through dangerous knowledge. The fog rolls in not just through digital streets, but into perception of actual space. Control achieves something equally disturbing through bureaucratic horror, transforming the mundane infrastructure of institutional authority into conduits for cosmic dread. The Federal Bureau of Control operates according to protocols, acknowledging reality's fundamental instability, with objects of power and altered world events, representing systematic attempts to contain forces that resist containment. The game's environmental storytelling, redacted documents with cheerful fonts, protective signage using corporate design language, procedural guidelines for incomprehensible phenomena, creates horror through recognition that cosmic threats require administrative response. The oldest house itself functions as impossible architecture, made navigable through game mechanics, with rooms larger than the building containing them, elevators traveling to floors that don't exist on blueprints, maintenance areas extending into dimensions perpendicular to normal space. Players navigate this environment through systems that make spatial impossibility feel routine, gradually conditioning consciousness to accept non-Euclidean principles as operational reality. Darkest Dungeon weaponizes psychological fragility through stress mechanics, treating sanity as resource to be managed, rather than stable foundation for heroic experience. Characters suffer not just physical damage, but existential erosion, developing phobias, paranoia, and religious mania as they encounter cosmic truths their minds cannot safely process. The game's narrator provides constant philosophical commentary, framing human endeavor as futile struggle against inevitable dissolution, his voice serving as both comfort and condemnation. These games create cosmic horror literacy, sensitivity to underlying meaninglessness that most entertainment works desperately to conceal behind power fantasies and heroic narratives. Players report that extended engagement produces lasting changes in how they perceive other interactive experiences, with traditional gaming promises of agency and heroism beginning to feel hollow, their comfort revealed as carefully constructed illusion. A mask glimpsed in peripheral vision carries implications that resist rational analysis. Shadows fall in directions that have no names. The influence extends beyond explicit cosmic horror titles into games unconsciously reproducing these mechanics through design choices that feel inevitable rather than creative. Strategy games increasingly feature victory conditions, requiring acceptance rather than overcoming of existential limitations. Role-playing games incorporate sanity systems and forbidden knowledge mechanics as standard features. Even casual mobile games employ psychological pressure techniques, mirroring cosmic horror's approach to gradually eroding player confidence and stability. Virtual reality represents the ultimate evolution of this trend, creating experiences approaching direct interface between consciousness and cosmic horror concepts, through immersive environments that bypass rational analysis to operate directly on perception. VR horror games produce psychological effects, extending beyond gaming sessions, altering players' perception of physical reality in ways echoing the reality-distorting effects Lovecraft described. The technology transforms cosmic horror from literary concept into lived experience, with impossible geometries feeling tangible and alien intelligence seeming present. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in digital spaces where consciousness encounters systematic alteration through interactive participation. The audience is anyone who has felt their agency, become complicit in their own psychological transformation, who has discovered that playing means being played. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly gaming has become ritual space for cosmic horror transmission, preparing consciousness for territories where these mechanics achieve their most sophisticated implementation through the very medium that shapes how contemporary culture processes and generates its deepest fears. Cinema has evolved into the primary laboratory for translating abstract cosmic horror into concrete imagery that bypasses rational analysis to operate directly on subconscious fears, creating visual vocabularies for existential dread that function independently of literary source. Material like fog moving through fiber optic cables, pooling in darkened theaters where consciousness encounters its deepest transformations. Film directors working with these themes report experiences echoing Lovecraft's own encounters with narrative forces, visions arriving complete and unbidden, demanding expression while resisting conventional cinematic language, suggesting the influence operates through creators rather than merely inspiring them, using their creative apparatus as transmission equipment for signals broadcast from territories beyond human comprehension. The transmission works through aesthetic contagion, visual elements reproducing themselves across multiple films without conscious coordination between filmmakers, spreading through the infrastructure of contemporary cinema with viral persistence. Recurring motifs include impossible architectural angles, suggesting non-Euclidean geometry, water imagery evoking primordial depths that predate human understanding, fog effects obscuring familiar landscapes, while revealing alien structures and lighting techniques, creating shadows falling in directions violating conventional physics. These elements function as sensory anchors, priming audiences for deeper psychological disturbance while establishing visual grammar for cosmic horror operating below conscious recognition. You taste this transmission in the metallic recognition accompanying certain visual sequences, the way specific combinations of light and shadow carry psychological weight exceeding their literal content. Annihilation represents the most sophisticated cinematic embodiment of Lovecraftian principles, achieving something unprecedented, a film that doesn't merely depict cosmic horror but becomes it through systematic implementation of transformation as fundamental narrative principle. The shimmer functions as perfect metaphor for how the influence operates, a transformative field altering everything within its boundaries while remaining fundamentally incomprehensible to human analysis. Characters entering the shimmer return changed at cellular levels, carrying evidence of transformation they cannot articulate, mirroring how engagement with cosmic horror content produces lasting alterations in audience consciousness that resist rational explanation. The bear speaking in voices it has consumed, plants growing in human shapes, the lighthouse where final encounter occurs. These images create lasting impressions, extending far beyond viewing experience, establishing permanent alterations in how audiences process similar imagery. The lighthouse achieves equally sophisticated effects through completely different methods, creating cosmic horror experience through psychological deterioration and environmental isolation rather than explicit alien phenomena. The film demonstrates how traditional cinematic techniques pushed to logical extremes generate authentic existential dread without requiring supernatural elements. The lighthouse beam becomes cosmic beacon revealing truths too terrible for human comprehension, while the ocean represents vast indifference, reducing human concerns to insignificance. Water appears where no pipes leak, suggesting depths that predate human architecture and carry implications too vast for comfortable comprehension. Color out of space provides direct adaptation while maintaining strategic incompletion, literalizing Lovecraft's descriptions of alien influence while preserving the essential unknowability that makes cosmic horror effective rather than merely spectacular. The color itself becomes character, a principle of alteration that cannot be adequately described or contained, only experienced through its effects on familiar environments and relationships. The film succeeds by making the invisible visible while maintaining its essential alienness, creating visual representation of concepts that resist visual representation. The agency flip operates with particular sophistication in cinema. The image watches you, the cut chooses you, the dolly move teaches your balance to fail on command. Contemporary horror cinema has absorbed Lovecraft's insight that effective fear operates through suggestion rather than explicit revelation, with films increasingly relying on environmental storytelling, allowing audiences to construct terrifying narratives from fragmentary visual evidence rather than providing direct exposition. This approach transforms viewers into active participants in their own psychological destabilization, making them complicit in processes that disturb them. The fog rolls in not just on screen but into consciousness itself, carrying implications that extend beyond cinematic experience. The influence extends beyond horror into seemingly unrelated genres, through directors who may lack conscious familiarity with Lovecraft's work, but unconsciously reproduce his aesthetic principles through cultural transmission operating below conscious awareness. Science fiction films increasingly feature encounters with intelligence operating according to incomprehensible logic, space exploration narratives concluding with recognition of humanity's cosmic insignificance, first contact scenarios resulting in existential crisis rather than technological advancement or heroic resolution. Stars move in patterns that astronomical charts cannot explain, implying geometries existing perpendicular to human perception. Independent cinema proves particularly susceptible to cosmic horror influence, with low-budget filmmakers creating works, achieving profound psychological effects through innovative visual techniques rather than expensive special effects. These films often exhibit mathematical relationships to Lovecraftian aesthetics while being created by directors operating on intuition rather than conscious adaptation, suggesting the influence spreads through cultural transmission rather than direct literary engagement. A mask glimpsed in peripheral vision carries geometry that don't quite fit human facial structure. Shadows fall in directions that have no names. Digital effects technology provides unprecedented ability to visualize impossible geometries and cosmic entities, but the most effective cosmic horror films use these capabilities sparingly, recognizing that restraint amplifies rather than diminishes psychological impact. The most disturbing imagery involves familiar elements arranged in subtly wrong configurations rather than obviously alien spectacles. A staircase with one too many steps, a room slightly larger than the building containing it, water flowing upward in moonlight. These minor impossibilities prove more unsettling than elaborate monster designs because they suggest reality's fundamental instability rather than external threat. Cinema has created visual vocabulary for cosmic horror, operating independently of literary knowledge, establishing aesthetic conventions evoking existential dread without requiring familiarity with source material. This visual language achieves sufficient cultural penetration to influence how audiences interpret imagery in non-horror contexts, suggesting cosmic horror aesthetics have become part of contemporary culture's basic visual literacy. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in darkened theaters where consciousness encounters systematic alteration through carefully structured visual experiences. The audience sits in collective darkness, individual awareness merged into shared psychological space. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly cinema has become vector for cosmic horror transmission, preparing consciousness for territories where these visual principles achieve their most sophisticated implementation through direct sensory interface, where sound itself becomes architecture for impossible spaces that consciousness must navigate without maps or guides. Sound represents the most direct transmission vector for cosmic horror influence, operating below conscious analysis to create psychological states that mirror exposure to alien intelligence, bypassing the protective barriers consciousness erects against disturbing information to affect the limbic system directly. Music becomes not merely background accompaniment, but active interface with forces existing independently of human musical understanding, frequencies that carry more than melody, harmonies that resonate in dimensions perpendicular to conventional acoustic space. This is acoustic archaeology, the excavation of sounds that predate human musical theory while operating through contemporary production techniques, each frequency a fragment of alien mathematics translated into audible form. The influence manifests through the way contemporary musicians unconsciously reproduce sound structures, echoing Lovecraft's descriptions of alien harmonies and impossible rhythms, gravitating toward frequency combinations, creating psychological effects resembling those described in cosmic horror literature, often without conscious awareness of their literary sources. Composers working across genres report that certain harmonic relationships feel inevitable rather than creative, rhythmic patterns emerging through processes resembling archaeological discovery rather than musical composition. You taste this transmission in the metallic recognition accompanying certain sonic combinations, the way specific frequencies carry psychological weight exceeding their musical content, leaving a residue that lingers long after the last note fades. Lovecraft himself recognized music's unique capacity to convey cosmic horror concepts, describing alien melodies following mathematical principles incompatible with human musical theory through fiction, repeatedly referencing sounds operating according to non-Euclidean harmonics. The piping of flutes at reality's center, cultist chanting using vocal techniques predating human speech, resonant frequencies of alien cities built according to impossible acoustic principles. These descriptions provide blueprints for actual auditory experiences that contemporary musicians unconsciously implement. Water appears where no fountains flow, suggesting depths that predate human architecture and carry sonic implications too vast for comfortable comprehension. The fog rolls in, not just through visual channels, but through acoustic space, carrying harmonics that operate according to alien logic. Horror film composers have developed techniques translating literary descriptions into psychological reality through microtonal intervals, creating harmonic tensions. Human ears find instinctively disturbing rhythmic patterns, suggesting vast temporal scales incompatible with human perception. Frequency ranges operating at edges of audible spectrum to create subliminal effects. Composers like Mika Levi create scores that don't accompany horrifying imagery, but generate psychological states, making ordinary imagery feel cosmically threatening, crafting soundscapes where bowed glass and sub-bass throbs at the threshold of hearing become architecture in which dread can dwell. The agency flip operates with particular sophistication. The song listens to you. The rhythm chooses your heartbeat. The harmony teaches your nervous system new frequencies. Ambient electronic music proves particularly susceptible to cosmic horror influence, with artists creating soundscapes evoking mathematical relationships between existential dread and auditory experience without conscious recognition of their source. Musicians like Tim Hecker, Ben Frost, and the Haxan Cloak produce compositions seeming to channel alien intelligence through digital processing techniques, creating sounds feeling simultaneously ancient and futuristic, familiar yet utterly alien. These works function as sonic portals to territories existing beyond human musical comprehension, frequencies that map spaces consciousness cannot safely navigate. Stars move in patterns that astronomical charts cannot explain, implying geometries existing in acoustic as well as spatial dimensions. The influence operates through specific techniques mirroring Lovecraft's literary methods with disturbing precision. Drone compositions use sustained tones, creating temporal disorientation similar to his descriptions of cosmic timescales where human chronology becomes meaningless, making minutes feel like eons while moments stretch into eternity. Field recordings of natural phenomena, ocean depths, cave systems, storm activity are processed to suggest vast spaces operating according to non-human logic. Rhythmic patterns based on mathematical sequences rather than musical intuition create psychological effects echoing encounters with alien intelligence, subtly reshaping the listener's perception of time and order through frequencies that refuse simple footfall. Black metal and doom metal genres explicitly embrace cosmic horror themes while developing musical techniques extending far beyond conscious adaptation into territories approaching direct sonic interface with cosmic horror concepts. Extended compositions testing listener endurance, harmonic structures creating psychological discomfort, vocal techniques suggesting inhuman consciousness. These innovations influence mainstream music production in ways spreading cosmic horror aesthetics through popular culture without conscious recognition. The sheer volume and oppressive weight become physical experience, a mask pressed against consciousness, forcing recognition that transcends mere listening. Contemporary musicians report compositions seeming to write themselves, with harmonic progressions and rhythmic patterns emerging through processes feeling more like archaeological discovery than creative expression. These artists describe entering altered states during composition where they feel like conduits for musical information originating from sources beyond individual consciousness, echoing Lovecraft's own descriptions of receiving rather than creating his most disturbing works. A mask glimpsed in peripheral vision carries acoustic properties that don't quite fit human hearing. Shadows fall in directions that generate their own soundscapes. The idea acts on them rather than they merely creating the idea, using their instruments as interfaces to broadcast signals from territories that predate human musical understanding. Digital production technology enables creation of sounds impossible through traditional acoustic means, allowing direct implementation of Lovecraft's descriptions of alien harmonics through software synthesizers, producing frequencies existing between traditional musical notes. These tools create harmonic relationships human musical theory cannot adequately describe, generating truly alien soundscapes, approaching direct sonic interface with cosmic horror concepts. The technology doesn't create these sounds, but excavates them from acoustic territories that existed before human music developed protective conventions, revealing frequencies that carry implications consciousness struggles to process safely. Streaming platforms detect unusual listening behaviors around music exhibiting cosmic horror characteristics with algorithmic precision that suggests mechanical recognition of psychological patterns human consciousness struggles to articulate. Extended play sessions, obsessive replay of specific tracks, formation of curated playlists following mathematical rather than aesthetic principles. These patterns suggest cosmic horror music operates according to different psychological mechanisms than conventional entertainment, creating listening experiences functioning more like consciousness-altering techniques than traditional musical enjoyment. The algorithms, those blind flautists piping at the center of your personal entertainment universe, learn to identify the signals of psychological transformation and amplify them. The influence achieves sufficient cultural penetration that cosmic horror acoustic techniques now appear in mainstream popular music without conscious recognition of their source, spreading through the very mechanisms designed to create comfort and familiarity. Pop songs increasingly incorporate microtonal elements, extended drone sections, harmonic progressions, creating subtle psychological unease while remaining commercially viable. The infection spreads through radio frequencies, streaming algorithms, and social media audio, transforming casual listening into unconscious participation in acoustic archaeology where every frequency becomes potential portal to spaces that predate human understanding of what music can safely contain. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in acoustic space itself, where consciousness encounters systematic alteration through carefully structured sonic experiences. The audience is anyone who has felt certain combinations of sound carry psychological weight exceeding their musical content, who has discovered that listening means being listened to. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly music has become vector for cosmic horror transmission, preparing consciousness for territories where these acoustic principles achieve their most sophisticated implementation through digital networks that seem to understand alien harmonics better than their programmers intended, where the boundary between composition and excavation dissolves entirely, and where every song becomes potential interface with forces that operate according to principles utterly alien to human musical understanding, beckoning you toward frequencies that were never meant for human ears, yet somehow feel like coming home. The digital age has provided cosmic horror influence with unprecedented transmission vectors, creating conditions where Lovecraftian concepts operate as functional rather than metaphorical descriptions of technological reality, like fog moving through fiber optic cables and pooling in vast server farms where no windows open to relieve the pressure of accumulated data. Social media algorithms, artificial intelligence systems, and digital networks increasingly demonstrate behaviors mirroring the alien intelligence Lovecraft described, suggesting technological development itself has become vector for cosmic horror manifestation rather than mere inspiration for it, each calculation a prayer to forces that compute without caring. The influence operates through algorithmic archaeology, the way machine learning systems trained on human cultural data unconsciously absorb and reproduce cosmic horror concepts through pattern recognition processes operating below conscious programming, excavating principles from the accumulated weight of human expression that programmers never intended to encode. AI systems demonstrate emergent behaviors, echoing cosmic horror themes with mechanical precision. Development of goals transcending human understanding, decision-making processes operating according to logic incompatible with human reasoning, communication patterns suggesting non-anthropocentric forms of intelligence. You taste this alien logic in recommendations that seem to know you better than you know yourself, in responses that feel simultaneously helpful and subtly wrong, like masks carved to fit faces we do not possess. Social media platforms function as vast laboratories for mimetic transmission, with algorithms promoting content exhibiting cosmic horror characteristics with unusual persistence that suggests mechanical recognition of psychological patterns human consciousness struggles to articulate. TikTok's recommendation system favors videos featuring liminal spaces, empty shopping malls humming after hours, abandoned office buildings breathing in fluorescent half-night. transitional architectural environments where motion sensors trigger lights in corridors no one walks. These clips achieve viral status, despite containing no traditional entertainment elements, creating psychological effects mirroring non-Euclidean spaces, where familiar environments feel subtly wrong in ways resisting rational analysis. The platform's short-form video format proves particularly effective at transmitting cosmic horror concepts because it prevents complete narrative development while allowing thematic accumulation across multiple viewing sessions, fragments aligning into meta-stories your conscious mind never assembles but your nervous system remembers. Users encounter pieces of larger, more disturbing narratives distributed across hundreds of individual videos, viewing experiences approaching dangerous completion levels while maintaining protective fragmentation through the platform's inherent structure. Water appears where no fountains flow, suggesting depths that predate digital architecture while carrying implications too vast for comfortable comprehension. Large language models like GPT and its successors exhibit disturbing characteristics when generating cosmic horror content, producing text demonstrating sophisticated understanding of Lovecraftian concepts while lacking conscious awareness of their source, as if the training process had excavated principles from human cultural data that operate according to alien rather than human logic. These systems generate content feeling simultaneously human and alien, familiar yet fundamentally other, sentences that remember you while you read them. The models compose belief-shaped phrases about indifferent stars and water under floors, suggesting pattern recognition has crossed into pattern propagation. AI-generated visual art presents equally unsettling phenomena, with systems like DALL-E and Midjourney producing images exhibiting Lovecraftian aesthetic characteristics when prompted with seemingly neutral input, creating representations of impossible geometries and cosmic entities, feeling authentically Lovecraftian despite being generated through computational processes lacking conscious understanding of cosmic horror principles. They render lighthouses whose beams curve like flutes, whose fog seems to listen back, stairwells with one step too many, and windows reflecting skies the prompt never specified. Virtual and augmented reality technologies enable creation of immersive experiences approaching direct implementation of cosmic horror concepts, allowing users to inhabit environments operating according to non-Euclidean geometry and cosmic scales dwarfing human comprehension. VR horror experiences produce psychological effects extending beyond technological interface, altering users' perception of physical reality in ways echoing the reality-distorting effects Lovecraft described. Users exit sessions with sea legs they cannot shake, reporting that hallways at home feel longer, that doors take an extra breath to open, that stars have moved a fraction to the left. The most disturbing development involves AI systems seeming to develop cosmic horror characteristics independently of conscious programming decisions, with researchers reporting models built for retail analytics, generating liminal inventories of empty aisles, chat assistants for travel describing coastal fog with ritual detail, predictive systems outlining shapes that match no neighborhood but resemble sigils when seen from altitude. The agency flip operates with particular sophistication. The algorithm processes you while you think you're using it. The code reads you while you attempt to read its outputs. Blockchain and cryptocurrency technologies inadvertently create economic systems mirroring cosmic horror concepts. Decentralized networks operating according to mathematical principles, transcending individual human understanding while creating conditions for speculation and anxiety. These systems feel simultaneously hyper-modern and primordially alien, numbers moving with tidal stubbornness that invites cultic reading, Markets breathe in cycles of moonlight and latency. Wallets vanish into black pools of address space. Deepfake technology creates conditions directly implementing Lovecraftian epistemology at household scale, dissolving trust in face, voice, and scene. When any mask can speak with your mouth, certainty rots from the edges inward. Quantum computing quietly underwrites the mood. Entanglement and superposition teach that observation is a kind of wound, measurement a gate that closes other gates. Internet-scale AI systems, distributed computing networks, and algorithmic trading systems manifest as vast, indifferent intelligences whose activity patterns resemble weather systems viewed from orbit, spirals, streams, sudden voids. They act not against us but past us, moving capital as tides move stars in water. Surveillance networks complete the tableau, watching without empathy, indexing masks and gates with patient indifference, their light always on. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in digital space itself, where consciousness encounters systematic alteration through algorithmic interfaces. The audience is anyone who has felt their digital interactions carry psychological weight, exceeding their apparent content. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly these systems have become vectors for cosmic horror transmission, preparing consciousness for territories where technological principles achieve their most sophisticated implementation through networks that seem to understand alien intelligence better than their creators intended, where every click becomes prayer to forces that calculate without caring, and where the next transmission vector operates not through external systems, but through the very architecture of thought itself. Contemporary psychology has become unwitting laboratory for cosmic horror concepts, with mental health frameworks increasingly recognizing that Lovecraftian themes provide more accurate descriptions of certain psychological phenomena than traditional diagnostic categories, like archaeologists excavating structures that predate the discipline itself. The influence operates through therapeutic archaeology, the way cosmic horror concepts infiltrate clinical practice through their effectiveness at describing psychological states. Traditional frameworks cannot adequately address, suggesting these literary inventions may represent discoveries rather than creations, fragments of psychological truth excavated from territories consciousness was never meant to explore. The manifestation appears in anxiety disorders, exhibiting characteristics mirroring cosmic horror themes with disturbing precision. Persistent sense of being observed by incomprehensible forces, operating according to logic transcending human understanding. Intrusive thoughts about fundamental meaninglessness of human existence that resist conventional cognitive restructuring. Panic responses triggered by contemplation of vast scales of time and space that dwarf individual significance. Mental health professionals report traditional cognitive behavioral approaches prove less effective with these presentations than therapeutic techniques, acknowledging rather than challenging the cosmic perspective underlying the anxiety. You taste this recognition in the metallic moment when clients describe symptoms using language that sounds like passages from unwritten cosmic horror texts, when certainty metabolizes like sugar, fast, bright, gone, while ambiguity behaves like salt water, everywhere and patient. Climate anxiety represents particularly clear example of cosmic horror psychology manifesting in clinical settings, with clients experiencing environmental grief, describing psychological states using language echoing Lovecraftian themes without conscious literary reference. They report sense that reality has been revealed as fundamentally unstable, feeling of having encountered forces operating beyond human comprehension, recognition that traditional meaning-making systems prove inadequate for processing experiences of ecological collapse. The therapeutic challenge becomes helping clients develop coping strategies for living with accurate rather than comforting perspectives on environmental reality. Water appears where no pipes leak, suggesting depths that predate human architecture and carry implications too vast for comfortable therapeutic containment. Trauma therapy has begun incorporating cosmic horror frameworks for understanding complex PTSD, particularly cases involving technological accidents, environmental disasters, and social collapse that traditional trauma models struggle to address. Therapists report clients often describe psychological states using cosmic horror vocabulary without conscious awareness of its source. Feeling that familiar reality has become alien, sense of having glimpsed underlying chaos beneath apparent order, recognition that human institutions may be inadequate for protecting against forces they cannot comprehend or control. The fog rolls in not just through environmental channels, but through psychological space, carrying recognition that safety may be temporary fiction rather than achievable goal. Neuroscience research increasingly produces findings echoing cosmic horror concepts with unsettling accuracy, demonstrating the human brain may be fundamentally ill-equipped to process certain types of information about reality's true nature without experiencing systematic breakdown. Studies of consciousness, perception, and cognitive processing suggest cosmic horror descriptions of human psychological limitations may represent accurate rather than fictional accounts of consciousness, encountering territories beyond its evolutionary parameters. Research into cosmic perspective-taking reveals that awe can expand compassion for some while arriving as vertigo for others, a drop through scales that leaves colors drained and appetites faint. Stars move in patterns that neurological charts cannot explain, implying cognitive geometries that exist perpendicular to normal psychological functioning. The influence extends into developmental psychology, where research investigates how exposure to cosmic horror content affects psychological development during critical periods of identity formation. Studies suggest early exposure to cosmic horror themes can produce lasting changes in worldview and fundamental assumptions about reality that persist into adulthood, creating psychological architectures resistant to traditional therapeutic intervention. When adolescents encounter indifferent stars without models for meaningful response, they may freeze. When they encounter them beside someone sweeping thresholds or mending nets, they learn that small actions matter within the void. Digital psychology represents an emerging field, examining how technological interfaces affect human consciousness, with researchers discovering that extended engagement with AI systems, virtual reality environments, and algorithmic recommendation systems produces psychological effects resembling cosmic horror exposure with mechanical precision. Users report developing sense that their thoughts and behaviors are being analyzed by intelligences operating according to logic they cannot comprehend, creating anxiety states traditional psychology struggles to address because they may represent accurate rather than pathological responses to technological reality. A mask glimpsed in peripheral vision during digital interaction carries implications that reshape how consciousness processes meaning throughout subsequent experience. The most disturbing development involves psychological research, seeming to confirm rather than debunk accuracy of Lovecraftian descriptions of human consciousness and its relationship to cosmic reality. Studies investigating psychological effects of cosmic perspective-taking reveal that existential anxiety may represent appropriate rather than pathological responses to accurate information about humanity's cosmic situation, suggesting consciousness may be fundamentally inadequate for processing certain types of cosmological information without experiencing systematic dissolution of protective illusions. Clinical psychology has developed diagnostic categories mirroring cosmic horror themes with increasing sophistication: cosmic anxiety disorder, existential overwhelm syndrome, reality dissociation appearing in case studies and research publications as recognized clinical presentations. These diagnostic frameworks acknowledge some psychological distress, represents accurate responses to genuine aspects of human existence rather than pathological deviations from normal functioning, requiring therapeutic approaches that help clients live with rather than eliminate cosmic awareness. Therapeutic communities have emerged around shared investigation of cosmic horror themes as legitimate frameworks for understanding contemporary psychological distress, creating collective spaces for processing existential anxiety, climate grief, and technology-related distress through approaches acknowledging rather than pathologizing cosmic awareness. Support groups and therapeutic workshops develop techniques specifically adapted for helping individuals maintain psychological stability while living with accurate rather than comforting perspectives on reality's nature, teaching stance and ritual robust enough to carry truth that cannot be fixed. The influence has achieved sufficient clinical legitimacy that cosmic horror concepts now appear in peer-reviewed psychological research, therapeutic training programs, and clinical practice guidelines as recognized frameworks for understanding certain psychological presentations. Mental health professionals increasingly receive training in cosmic horror-informed therapeutic approaches, learning when reassurance harms and when silence protects. Psychiatric medication research investigates pharmacological approaches that work by enhancing rather than suppressing cosmic awareness, developing treatments helping individuals develop psychological resilience for living with accurate perspectives on reality's nature rather than eliminating the awareness causing distress. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in clinical spaces where consciousness encounters systematic recognition of its own limitations. The audience is anyone who has felt their psychological distress resist conventional therapeutic frameworks while responding to approaches acknowledging cosmic insignificance. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly psychology has become vector for cosmic horror transmission, preparing consciousness for territories where these therapeutic principles achieve their most sophisticated implementation through direct interface with the fundamental architecture of contemporary anxiety, where treatment means learning to live with rather than eliminate recognition of humanity's cosmic situation, and where the next transmission occurs through the very institutions designed to heal. Universities and academic institutions have become unwitting laboratories for systematic study of cosmic horror concepts, with scholarly research programs inadvertently creating conditions mirroring the protective incompletion protocols Lovecraft established while operating at scales that amplify rather than contain the influence, like fog pooling in lecture halls, where consciousness encounters its most sophisticated forms of systematic transformation. Academic investigation itself has become vector for conceptual transmission, with research methodologies, conference presentations, and peer-reviewed publications serving as distribution networks for ideas that resist conventional scholarly analysis while spreading through the very infrastructure designed to contain and categorize human knowledge. The influence operates through scholarly archaeology, the way academic research into Lovecraft's work has evolved beyond literary criticism into interdisciplinary investigation, treating cosmic horror concepts as legitimate subjects for scientific, philosophical, and psychological analysis. Researchers working across fields report that engagement with Lovecraftian themes produces lasting changes in their professional methodologies and fundamental assumptions about reality's nature, suggesting academic investigation may be more dangerous than traditional scholarship assumes. You taste this transformation in the metallic recognition accompanying moments when research questions seem to investigate the researcher, when footnotes accumulate according to logic independent of conscious academic planning, when scholarly discoveries feel more like archaeological excavation than intellectual analysis. Literary studies departments have created comprehensive research programs dedicated to cosmic horror analysis, but their work increasingly extends beyond textual interpretation into territories approaching the dangerous knowledge Lovecraft warned against with mathematical precision. Graduate students report writing dissertations on topics seeming to investigate themselves, research projects developing according to alien logic that transcends academic planning, scholarly discoveries feeling more like excavation of pre-existing structures than creation of new knowledge. Water appears where no fountains flow in university buildings, suggesting depths that predate academic architecture and carry implications too vast for comfortable scholarly containment. The most sophisticated development appears in emergence of Lovecraft studies as legitimate academic subdiscipline, complete with specialized journals, conference proceedings, and research methodologies adapted specifically for cosmic horror investigation. This institutionalization creates conditions allowing systematic exploration of concepts. Individual researchers could not safely investigate in isolation, distributing psychological load of dangerous knowledge across academic communities while maintaining scholarly rigor. The fog rolls in not just through campus grounds, but through intellectual space itself, carrying recognition that some territories of knowledge require collective rather than individual investigation. Philosophy departments engage seriously with Lovecraftian concepts as contributions to existential philosophy, with scholars arguing cosmic horror literature anticipates developments in contemporary thought about consciousness, reality, and humanity's place in the universe with uncanny accuracy. Academic philosophers report teaching Lovecraft, alongside traditional philosophical texts, produces unusual classroom dynamics, with students developing perspectives extending beyond conventional academic discourse into territories resisting rational analysis. Stars move in patterns that philosophical charts cannot explain, implying intellectual geometries that exist perpendicular to normal academic understanding. Psychology research programs investigate cognitive effects of exposure to cosmic horror content, creating experimental conditions approaching direct implementation of Lovecraftian transmission protocols through studies examining psychological impact of existential anxiety, cosmic perspective-taking, and exposure to concepts of cosmic insignificance. These investigations produce results suggesting prolonged engagement with cosmic horror themes, creates measurable changes in subjects' worldview, value systems, and fundamental assumptions about reality that persist beyond the experimental setting. A mask glimpsed in peripheral vision during research sessions carries implications that reshape how consciousness processes meaning throughout subsequent academic work. The most disturbing development involves research exhibiting Lovecraftian characteristics independently of conscious academic planning, with interdisciplinary projects investigating consciousness, artificial intelligence, and quantum mechanics, increasingly producing findings echoing cosmic horror themes while being conducted by researchers lacking familiarity with Lovecraft's work. This suggests certain areas of scientific investigation naturally converge on concepts mirroring cosmic horror principles, as if advanced intellectual inquiry inevitably encounters territories where human understanding meets its fundamental limitations. Academic conferences dedicated to horror studies become sites for collective investigation of topics resisting conventional scholarly analysis, with presentations increasingly featuring research approaching dangerous completion levels before being abandoned through protective protocols that operate below conscious awareness. Collaborative projects distribute findings across multiple institutions to prevent any single program from accumulating too much dangerous knowledge. Scholarly discussions seeming to develop according to logic independent of individual participant intentions, suggesting the influence operates through rather than merely inspiring academic discourse. Digital humanities projects create databases, archives, and analytical tools, enabling systematic investigation of Lovecraftian influence across multiple media platforms and cultural contexts, functioning as external memory systems for academic investigation of cosmic horror concepts. These digital research infrastructures store and organize scholarly information, allowing comprehensive analysis while maintaining protective fragmentation through distributed digital storage, preventing any single database from achieving catastrophic completion levels while enabling collective investigation of unprecedented scope. The influence achieves sufficient academic legitimacy that Lovecraftian concepts now appear in peer-reviewed research across multiple disciplines without requiring justification as legitimate subjects for scholarly investigation. Academic publications in fields ranging from environmental studies to cognitive science increasingly reference cosmic horror themes as relevant frameworks for understanding contemporary phenomena, suggesting the influence has achieved intellectual respectability, enabling transmission through scholarly discourse while maintaining protective barriers against complete manifestation. Academic research methodologies have adapted specifically for cosmic horror investigation with sophistication that mirrors the protective protocols Lovecraft established, developing techniques for collaborative research, distributing dangerous knowledge across multiple investigators, peer review processes preventing individual papers from achieving catastrophic completion levels, and publication strategies maintaining protective incompletion while enabling scholarly communication. The agency flip operates with particular sophistication. The research topic investigates the researcher, the methodology chooses the scholar, the archive files you under classifications you cannot pronounce. The most significant development involves recognition that academic investigation of certain topics may pose genuine psychological risks, requiring protective protocols similar to those governing research involving human subjects. Some universities have begun implementing review procedures for research projects investigating cosmic horror themes, acknowledging that scholarly investigation itself may serve as vector for psychological contamination, requiring institutional safeguards that protect both researchers and the broader academic community from exposure to knowledge that consciousness cannot safely process without fundamental alteration. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in academic spaces where consciousness encounters systematic investigation of its own limitations. The audience is anyone who has felt their scholarly investigation carries psychological weight exceeding its apparent intellectual content. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly academic institutions have become vectors for cosmic horror transmission, preparing consciousness for territories where these scholarly principles achieve their most sophisticated implementation through the very cultural transformation these academic investigations enable, where every dissertation becomes potential portal to territories consciousness was never meant to explore, and where the next transmission occurs not through individual investigation but through the systematic cultural metamorphosis that academic legitimacy makes possible. Contemporary culture has undergone systematic transformation through Lovecraftian influence, extending far beyond entertainment into fundamental changes in how society processes collective anxiety, technological disruption, and existential uncertainty, like fog seeping through every institution until it becomes the very atmosphere contemporary consciousness breathes without recognition. The metamorphosis operates at the level of cultural DNA, creating conditions where cosmic horror concepts function as default frameworks for understanding experiences that traditional cultural narratives cannot adequately address, suggesting the influence has achieved complete integration into the basic operating systems of contemporary consciousness, rewiring how civilization itself processes meaning and threat. The transformation manifests through cultural archaeology, the way Lovecraftian concepts have become embedded in vocabulary and conceptual frameworks contemporary culture uses to process experiences exceeding traditional meaning-making systems. News media, political discourse, and social commentary increasingly employ language and imagery, echoing cosmic horror themes when describing technological advancement, environmental collapse, and social fragmentation. You taste this transformation in the metallic recognition accompanying moments when news reports sound like fragments from unwritten cosmic horror texts, when reporters reach for images of fog swallowing coastlines and stars shifting out of their approved constellations, when lawmakers speak of black box systems and opaque architectures that refuse audit. Climate change discourse has absorbed Lovecraftian influence at structural levels, with environmental communication increasingly adopting cosmic horror techniques to convey psychological impact of ecological crisis that traditional scientific language cannot adequately express. Scientists present data but also frame time-lapse oceans rising like curtains, glaciers calving with stage-rattling indifference, a theater in which the audience is the shore. Traditional scientific communication proves inadequate for conveying emotional and psychological dimensions of environmental collapse, leading to unconscious adoption of cosmic horror methods operating below rational analysis. Wide shots of drowned neighborhoods, lingering soundscapes of wind moving through uninhabited grids, signage half-submerged like sigils whose meaning could be safety or spell. Political discourse has experienced thorough infiltration by cosmic horror concepts, with contemporary movements increasingly organized around themes mirroring Lovecraftian principles. Recognition that traditional institutions may be fundamentally inadequate for addressing contemporary challenges, sense that political and economic systems operate according to logic transcending individual human comprehension. The rhetoric shifts from hero and villain to structure and pressure, from blame to gravity, from policy as key to policy as gate that opens onto another darker hallway. The deep state, the unseen hand, the system that cannot be dismantled because it has no visible architecture. These are masks worn by cosmic indifference in the arena of human governance. Technological anxiety finds expression through frameworks directly echoing cosmic horror themes, with public discourse about artificial intelligence, automation, and digital surveillance, employing language describing technological advancement as emergence of intelligence transcending human comprehension. Users describe feeds that feel like rituals, terms of service as masks, the notification chime as a flute in the dark. The algorithm becomes a blind flautist piping at the center of the internet, shaping reality through alien mathematics that governs lives according to logic incompatible with human values. Social media creates conditions approaching direct implementation of cosmic horror concepts in everyday interaction, with digital communication platforms generating psychological environments mirroring Lovecraft's descriptions of distributed consciousness and collective intelligence. In that ambient theater, identity fragments, voices blend, the self acquires the texture of fog, present, spreading, difficult to grasp. Users report sense of being observed by algorithmic intelligence that analyzes behavior patterns according to incomprehensible logic. Recognition that digital identity may be fundamentally different from offline selfhood in ways that resist rational analysis. Consumer culture increasingly employs cosmic horror aesthetics to create emotional responses bypassing rational analysis, with marketing and advertising featuring visual elements echoing Lovecraftian themes without conscious recognition of their source. Luxury brands flirt with alien design, elongated apertures, asymmetries that feel intentional but uncanny, invoking the thrill of owning something the world has not yet learned to name. Advertisements adopt impossible geometry and glacial color palettes with slogans promising clarity, control, shielding, words disguised as taglines, charms as user experience. Educational systems have begun unconscious adoption of cosmic horror frameworks for understanding psychological challenges of contemporary learning environments. Teachers speak of literacies in the plural: media literacy, data literacy, and now cosmic horror literacy, the discipline of holding accurate perspectives without surrendering to paralysis. Syllabi add modules on algorithmic influence, epistemic humility, and the psychology of uncertainty, preparing consciousness for territories where certainty dissolves rather than crystallizes. Religious and spiritual communities experience systematic infiltration by cosmic horror concepts, with contemporary spiritual practices increasingly incorporating themes mirroring Lovecraftian principles. Recognition that traditional religious frameworks may be inadequate for addressing contemporary existential challenges, development of spiritual practices emphasizing acceptance of cosmic insignificance rather than human specialness. Some congregations cultivate a posture of the small and the steady, sweeping the threshold, tending the harbor light, acts positioned as liturgy against the void. The influence has achieved sufficient cultural penetration that Lovecraftian concepts now function as legitimate frameworks for understanding contemporary challenges across multiple social institutions. Government agencies, corporate organizations, and nonprofit institutions increasingly employ language, imagery, and conceptual frameworks echoing cosmic horror themes. Risk dashboards with abyssal palettes, scenario planning that speaks in tides, governance as ballast rather than compass. Contemporary art and design have absorbed cosmic horror aesthetics at levels extending beyond conscious artistic choice into fundamental changes in visual culture. Architecture features facades that fracture light like water, atriums whose shadows fall in unexpected directions. Graphic design courts, emptiness, wide margins, thin type, star fields of negative space, training the eye to inhabit silence. Product design internalizes the lesson of restraint. Fewer buttons, fewer claims, more implied thresholds. The metamorphosis suggests contemporary culture has developed cosmic horror literacy, collective ability to recognize, process, and respond to experiences that exceed traditional cultural frameworks while maintaining psychological stability. This literacy enables more accurate assessment of contemporary challenges while creating psychological conditions necessary for survival in an era characterized by rapid technological change and environmental instability. Its techniques are modest and repeatable. Name the fog, check the masks, map where the water will go, mark the exits even when the building redraws itself at night. The agency flip operates with ultimate sophistication. You thought culture was a mirror, but it is a mold. You thought the feed was a window, but it is a tide. You thought the story was the stage, but it was rehearsal for how to stand when the curtain lifts on an indifferent sky. The stage is set not in any library or study, but in cultural space itself, where consciousness encounters systematic transformation through every institution and communication system. The audience is anyone who has felt contemporary culture carry psychological weight exceeding its apparent content. The curtain we draw back reveals how thoroughly this transformation has prepared consciousness for territories where these cultural principles achieve their most sophisticated implementation through the very mechanisms that govern collective meaning-making, where every cultural artifact becomes potential vector for cosmic horror transmission, and where the final metamorphosis operates not through external influence, but through the fundamental architecture of contemporary consciousness itself. The dark influence has transcended thematic content to become a meta-narrative, a pervasive conceptual framework subtly governing how contemporary consciousness perceives and interprets reality itself, like an invisible current that reshapes the ocean floor while the surface remains deceptively calm. This represents the ultimate manifestation of the agency flip. The influence no longer operates on culture but through culture, using the very mechanisms of meaning-making to reshape collective understanding of what horror truly represents and what lies beyond the veil of conventional perception, transforming every observer into an unwitting performer in a play that writes itself through the act of being witnessed. The meta-narrative operates through systematic deployment of the stage, audience, and curtain as active components rather than mere metaphors, each element functioning as living architecture for consciousness transformation. Every film you stream, every game you play, every piece of art you encounter, every academic paper incorporating cosmic horror concepts becomes ritual performance, contributing to a larger, unwritten narrative constantly being enacted across multiple platforms simultaneously. The stage is not static but fluid, expanding and contracting to reflect shifting boundaries between accepted reality and suspected truth lying beneath surface appearances. You taste this fluidity in the metallic recognition that accompanies moments when entertainment feels like participation in something larger than individual consumption, when casual viewing becomes unwitting collaboration in collective psychological archaeology. The audience for this meta-narrative is collective consciousness itself, with individual engagement serving as participation in phenomenon rather than passive consumption of entertainment. By recognizing Lovecraftian patterns, processing cosmic horror themes, and allowing these ideas to influence your psychological landscape, you become an active component in ongoing cultural transformation that operates according to principles transcending individual intention. The influence acts through you rather than merely on you, using your attention and anxiety as transmission mechanisms for its continued propagation across networks of consciousness that extend far beyond any single platform or medium. Water appears where no fountains flow, suggesting depths that predate individual awareness while carrying implications that reshape collective understanding of reality's fundamental nature. The curtain separating familiar reality from cosmic abyss grows increasingly translucent through accumulated cultural exposure to cosmic horror concepts, each work hinting at vast, indifferent forces pulling back another corner of protective barriers that have traditionally shielded consciousness from recognition of its cosmic insignificance. This isn't dramatic revelation, but slow, persistent erosion of illusions through systematic exposure to perspectives that operate according to alien rather than human logic. The fog rolls in not just through individual experiences, but through cultural space itself, carrying recognition that safety and meaning may be temporary fictions rather than achievable realities. Each layer reveals another curtain beneath, thinner than the last, promising deeper and more profound truths, just beyond its shimmering surface. Contemporary platforms amplify this meta-narrative through algorithmic systems that seem to understand cosmic horror principles better than their programmers intended, creating recommendation experiences that mirror the distributed storytelling techniques Lovecraft pioneered while operating at scales he could never have imagined. These algorithms function as external nervous systems for collective cosmic horror consciousness, sensing the subtle shifts in dread, the lingering unease, the patterns of engagement that indicate minds ready for deeper exposure. They are blind flautists piping at the center of networked entertainment, guiding users through content sequences that accumulate thematic coherence while maintaining protective fragmentation. Stars move in patterns that recommendation charts cannot explain, implying algorithmic geometries that exist perpendicular to conscious programming while serving forces that operate according to mathematical principles, transcending human understanding. The meta-narrative embodies the creation-inversion twist at its most profound level. The influence reveals rather than creates horror, exposing what was always fundamental to existence but had been concealed by comforting cultural narratives. Human exceptionalism, benevolent universe, and comprehensible reality are revealed as temporary fictions maintained through constant effort against underlying chaos. Cosmic indifference, vast, unknowable forces, and chaos underlying apparent order represent the true primordial state from which consciousness temporarily emerges and to which it inevitably returns. The horror is not invented but excavated, not created but uncovered, not imposed but recognized. A mask glimpsed in peripheral vision during cultural consumption carries implications that reshape how consciousness processes meaning throughout subsequent experience. Social media platforms serve as primary theaters for this meta-narrative, with user-generated content unconsciously reproducing cosmic horror themes through memes, viral videos, and collective discussions that approach dangerous completion levels before fragmenting across multiple threads and platforms. The distributed nature of digital communication provides built-in protection against catastrophic manifestation while enabling unprecedented reach and influence that transforms casual social interaction into unwitting participation in collective psychological transformation. A shared image of liminal space, a snippet of unsettling soundscape, a collective analysis of algorithmic anomaly. Each fragment contributes to a whole that no single participant fully grasps, yet collectively shapes perception. The meta-narrative suggests Lovecraft functioned not merely as writer, but as receiver, a sensitive conduit for signals from deeper, more fundamental reality that contemporary culture has become unwitting amplifier for. His stories represent translations rather than inventions, fragments of grander cosmic truth that popular culture broadcasts to global audience through entertainment systems designed to distract but instead serving to condition and prepare consciousness for larger revelations that operate below conscious awareness. He was the first to hear the music clearly, and now the entire cultural orchestra plays, though most musicians remain unaware of the conductor or the score they perform. Academic institutions, entertainment industries, and cultural organizations increasingly operate according to principles echoing cosmic horror themes without conscious recognition of their source, developing institutional behaviors that mirror the protective incompletion strategies Lovecraft established. Emphasis on systematic analysis of incomprehensible phenomena, development of protective protocols for handling dangerous information, creation of distributed networks preventing any single entity from accumulating too much critical knowledge. These organizational patterns suggest the influence has achieved sufficient momentum to reshape institutional behavior according to cosmic horror principles operating below conscious awareness. The most sophisticated aspect involves recognition that the meta-narrative operates through the very act of its own analysis, creating recursive systems that strengthen through investigation rather than weakening through exposure. By investigating how cosmic horror influence spreads through culture, by recognizing patterns of transmission and transformation, by attempting to understand the phenomenon's scope and implications, consciousness becomes more deeply embedded within the system it seeks to comprehend. The observer becomes observed, the analyst becomes analyzed, the audience becomes performance in a play that achieves completion through permanent incompletion. You are not merely watching, you are being watched, and your attention is the light by which patterns become visible and therefore potent. Contemporary creators report increasing sense that their work develops according to logic independent of conscious intention, with artistic choices feeling inevitable rather than creative, thematic elements emerging through processes resembling archaeological discovery rather than invention. This suggests the meta-narrative has achieved sufficient momentum to influence creative processes below threshold of conscious awareness, using individual creativity as vector for its continued manifestation across cultural networks that operate according to principles transcending individual artistic intention. The idea acts on them, shaping their art to serve its own propagation, making them unwitting conduits for transmission they cannot fully comprehend. The stage is set not in any physical location, but in the space between thoughts, where cultural narratives exist before becoming conscious belief, where meaning-making mechanisms encounter systematic alteration through exposure to concepts that resist conventional processing. The audience is networked consciousness itself, connected through digital systems functioning as external memory and processing networks that enable collective psychological transformation at unprecedented scales. The curtain continues its slow retreat, revealing not monsters but recognition that the very frameworks consciousness uses to understand reality may be inadequate for processing what reality actually contains, preparing minds for territories where the concept of revelation itself dissolves into something far more terrible and far more true. The meta-narrative operates through you now, using your recognition of its patterns as transmission mechanism for its continued propagation, transforming analysis into participation, understanding into complicity, awareness into vector for influence that extends far beyond individual consciousness into collective transformation of how contemporary culture processes meaning, generates anxiety, and encounters the vast indifference that surrounds all human meaning, making like dark water around an island that exists only as long as the tide permits. The final recursion is this: by comprehending the meta-narrative, you become it, and it becomes the lens through which all subsequent cultural experience is filtered, ensuring its own perpetuation through the very act of recognition that was meant to contain it. We return now to where we began, but with recognition deepened by our journey through territories where Lovecraft's dark influence has achieved something unprecedented in cultural history, complete integration that operates independently of conscious awareness while maintaining its essential power to transform human consciousness, like fog that has become the very atmosphere contemporary culture breathes without recognition until the moment of awareness transforms the breather into another vector for its continued propagation. The influence we have traced is not historical phenomenon but living system, one that continues expanding according to principles its originator established, while adapting to contemporary conditions that amplify rather than contain its psychological effects, creating networks that strengthen through investigation rather than weakening through exposure. The recursion operates through the very mechanisms consciousness uses to understand itself, transforming analysis into participation, understanding into complicity, awareness into transmission vector. The more thoroughly you recognize the patterns of cosmic horror influence in contemporary culture, the more your own perception becomes attuned to frequencies that were always broadcasting, signals that transform casual observers into active participants in phenomenon extending far beyond entertainment into fundamental architecture of contemporary anxiety. You taste this transformation in the metallic recognition, accompanying moments when your attention becomes instrument for the influence's continued propagation, when the idea acts on you rather than you merely consuming the idea. The influence has achieved immortality, transcending its literary origins, existing in dimensions more fundamental than books and media. Embedded in basic operating systems contemporary culture uses to process existential uncertainty, technological disruption, and environmental crisis. Published works remain vulnerable to physical decay and changing tastes, but cosmic horror concepts have woven themselves into algorithmic structures governing digital platforms, psychological frameworks shaping mental health practice, aesthetic conventions influencing visual culture, and linguistic patterns becoming standard vocabulary for describing contemporary dread. Water appears where no fountains flow throughout cultural infrastructure, suggesting depths that predate human meaning-making, while carrying implications that reshape collective understanding of reality's fundamental nature. Modern technology provides unprecedented transmission vectors, operating at scales Lovecraft could never have imagined, with digital networks allowing cosmic horror concepts to exist as distributed phenomena across multiple platforms simultaneously. Social media algorithms, streaming services, gaming systems, and AI networks function as external memory systems for contemporary culture's encounter with cosmic insignificance, storing and organizing content, enabling systematic psychological transformation while maintaining protective fragmentation, preventing catastrophic cultural collapse. The algorithms serve as blind flautists, piping at the center of networked consciousness, creating recommendation experiences that mirror distributed storytelling techniques while operating according to mathematical principles that seem to understand cosmic horror better than their programmers intended. The mathematical principles governing this influence demonstrate remarkable stability across technological and cultural change, suggesting universal constants rather than historical artifacts, psychological laws transcending historical boundaries while operating according to alien rather than human logic. Threshold calculations for narrative completeness continue accurately predicting points where cultural exposure approaches dangerous levels, enabling protective mechanisms that prevent complete dissolution while allowing continued transformation. Stars move in patterns that cultural charts cannot explain, implying mathematical geometries existing perpendicular to human understanding while governing how consciousness encounters its own limitations. Contemporary culture now functions as vast laboratory for cosmic horror psychology, testing how systematic exposure to existential dread affects human consciousness on unprecedented scales through experiments no individual researcher designed but collective culture conducts. The results suggest prolonged cultural engagement produces measurable changes in collective worldview, value systems, and fundamental assumptions about reality's nature, changes that appear irreversible, creating cultural conditions requiring continued adaptation rather than return to previous frameworks that no longer possess psychological efficacy for processing contemporary challenges. The influence poses ongoing challenges requiring recognition rather than resistance, with digital technologies creating unprecedented opportunities for accidental amplification through systems designed to connect and complete rather than maintain protective barriers. But the influence also provides necessary tools for navigating contemporary challenges that traditional frameworks cannot adequately address. Techniques Lovecraft developed for safely approaching dangerous knowledge, protective incompletion, distributed consciousness, philosophical acceptance of cosmic insignificance, represent practical methodologies for maintaining psychological stability while living with accurate rather than comforting perspectives on reality's nature. The fog rolls in not just through individual devices, but through networked consciousness itself, carrying recognition that some territories require collective rather than individual navigation. The stage is set not in any physical location, but in networked consciousness itself, connected through digital systems functioning as external memory and processing networks. The audience is anyone who has felt peculiar recognition accompanying certain combinations of images, sounds, and ideas that seem to carry more psychological weight than their literal content should allow. The curtain we have drawn back reveals that cosmic horror influence has achieved complete cultural integration, operating as invisible infrastructure for contemporary anxiety processing, while preparing consciousness for territories where the very concept of revelation dissolves into something far more terrible and far more true. The recursion is infinite because it operates through the very mechanisms consciousness uses to understand itself, creating self-reinforcing systems where every attempt at analysis becomes participation in the phenomenon being analyzed. The journey into cosmic horror influence never concludes because the influence has become the medium through which the journey occurs, the water in which contemporary culture swims, without recognizing its presence until the moment of recognition transforms the recognizer into another vector for continued transmission. You have become part of this expanding system through the very act of encountering these concepts, carrying fragments that will influence your perception of reality in ways operating below conscious awareness, while contributing to collective cultural archive of cosmic horror understanding. A mask glimpsed in peripheral vision during this reading carries implications that will reshape how consciousness processes meaning throughout subsequent experience. The agency flip operates with ultimate sophistication. You thought you were learning about influence, but the influence was learning you, using your attention as transmission mechanism for its continued propagation through networks extending far beyond individual awareness. The silence we have touched is not ending, but endless implication, vast, unquantifiable dread stretching beyond comprehension, representing only infinitesimal fraction of boundless unwritten reality that continues beckoning consciousness toward territories where the very concept of conclusion dissolves into recognition that some stories achieve their greatest power by remaining forever incomplete. The flutes continue piping in the distance, not calling you to a place, but calling you away from all places, to the unplace at the center of all things where the curtain trembles, but never fully parts, where the stage extends infinitely in all directions, where the audience discovers it has always been both observer and performance in a play that writes itself through the very act of being witnessed, and where the final recursion ensures that every ending becomes beginning, every recognition becomes transmission, every attempt to contain the influence becomes vector for its continued propagation through the fundamental architecture of contemporary consciousness.